From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, this is Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. We've got a great show for you today, but before we start, I wanted to make a very important announcement. Quivira Coalition, Holistic Management International, and the American Grass-Fed Association are excited to announce plans for the 2020 Regenerate Conference, Resilience in Times of Uncertainty, which will bring us together virtually at this challenging time to collectively chart a path forward for our working lands and food systems. This multi-week event, which will start in early November, will include 5 to 7 plenary sessions, a set of facilitated roundtable discussions and regional forums, technical workshops, and networking opportunities. Some of the topics to be explored include regenerative agriculture in the face of climate change, racial equity in agriculture, financing regenerative agriculture, diversifying markets and indigenous land management, and many more. Visit the Quivira Coalition website for dates and other details, along with information on sponsorship, registration, and scholarships. That's quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. Thank you so much, and now today's program. I'm very happy to welcome Jason Baldes. He is Tribal Buffalo Coordinator for the National Wildlife Federation, and we're here to talk about the restoration of buffalo to landscapes on tribal lands and public lands. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, you are part of the Eastern Shoshone tribe from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming, and buffaloes were very much part of your culture. And I was wondering if we could start by just kind of like looking back what that relationship was like between your people and the buffalo, how they were used and how they were regarded traditionally.
Yeah, the buffalo was life's commissary. The buffalo or bison was food, clothing, shelter, tools. It was also central to our ceremonial spirituality, ways, and customs. And so it really was everything to us. We actually distinguished ourselves by the foods that we ate. And the name for ourselves is the gweechoon, the buffalo eaters. And so that animal was critical to the survival of the Shoshone people, as well as many other tribes who depended upon that animal for their livelihood. Prior to European arrival here, we relied on the wildlife economy. So there was no money here, but people were rich in the abundance of animals and fish and plants, foods and medicines that grow all around us. And so the people were very knowledgeable about where and when and how to acquire those foods. And so buffalo allowed for the making of our lodges. It would take 14 to 16 buffalo hides to make one teepee or lodge. And the parts of the buffalo were critical for survival. So imagine a time without kitchen utensils, without pots and pans or iron or the things that we take for granted today. There was only what you could acquire from the landscape and from the animals. And so imagine cooking a meal for your entire family without pots and pans. How would you do that? We did that with a buffalo stomach. The buffalo stomach is a natural container. It can carry 5 to 8 gallons of water. And when you hang that up on a tripod and you put your ingredients in there from your new buffalo kill, and you collect those roots and tubers from the grocery store that grows all around us, then you would put in hot rocks and they would boil the water and cook the food. And so meals were made by using the buffalo stomach. But things like tools that were carved from the bones, like the scapula or the shin bones, to make things like awls and needles, thread that came from the sinew of the backbone. Hooves were melted down to make glue. The bladder itself was used for a water container. The internal organs were very important for ingesting, like the liver and the kidneys and the heart, which contain essential minerals and nutrients that today we get from vegetables. Utilizing the hide. If you had a hide, winter hide, you could be able to stay warm in the coldest winters that this region has to offer. So that buffalo really ensured the survival of people, but not only buffalo, pronghorn antelope, moose, bighorn sheep, pronghorn deer, turkeys, sage grouse, rabbits. All of the species that are here in this region was where the wealth was, and that's where those relationships with not only the four-legged but the winged ones and the fish and the ones that crawl above and below the ground, all are seen as our relatives. We have these sayings in our languages about respecting and connecting with all of our relatives. And that means not just our family human relatives, but it means all of those other elements. And so that buffalo was critical, but so were all of those other wildlife species. But buffalo was most important and was systematically removed from Native American people. And so that's a sad history to understand and learn about, but is very important in contemporarily why we are restoring bison to tribal land.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, there's two pieces to that. What happened to the people when they're, as you say, commissary, or as you sometimes say to the kids, it's like the buffalo was our Walmart. But what happened to the people and what happened to the landscape are inextricably connected. And the way you were talking about the buffalo and the relationship to all these other creatures and animals and plants and living things on the landscape, talk about how you're thinking about buffalo restoration in terms of the larger landscape, buffalo as a keystone species, for example.
Yeah, so, the story of buffalo and native people is very similar in that we're now on isolated remnants of our once former vast territories. Buffalo in parks and refuges and private ranches, and Native Americans on reservations. And so their story is somewhat synonymous in that buffalo used to take care of us, but now it's our turn to take care of that buffalo. And so the cultural revitalization that happens when you bring buffalo back, it allows us to then begin eating them again. It allows us to begin utilizing them for ceremonial use and for arts and crafts and for teaching our children about how you butcher a buffalo or how you utilize certain parts of it. That's very important, but if we want to talk about ecological restoration, you can't do that without the keystone species. And buffalo as a keystone species benefit many, many other organisms on the landscape. Their unique dust bathing behavior, their wallowing behavior, creates microdepressions and ephemeral pools on the landscape that are very important in seed dispersal and water accumulation. Many of the plants that we would utilize as foods, tools, and medicines are associated with these wallows. And because bison are primarily graminoid feeders, they eat the grasses and leave the forb species. Plant biodiversity actually increases with buffalo on the landscape. Buffalo naturally aerate the soil when they walk with their hooves. They have twice the surface area on their teeth as a cow does, allowing them to ingest much less hardy forage, especially during the winter months when they can actually slow their metabolism. A buffalo has 7 times the hair per square inch as a cow does, allowing them to exist in almost any climate that we have been able to put them in. They existed from coast to coast, from the Arctic to Mexico, from sea level to 13,000 feet in elevation. So they were very adept at belonging and utilizing the lands in which they were. And there's also certain bird species that require buffalo hair for their eggs to reach the right incubation temperature. When there were millions of buffalo, there would have been an abundance of this hair, which would have been critical. So birds like the mountain plover and the ferruginous hawk and the burrowing owl, the pronghorn antelope, the prairie dog and black-footed ferrets and other ferrets and badgers, when you put buffalo back on the landscape, especially one that's been degraded, you will see the plant and animal biodiversity increase because of their keystone role in the environment and what they do in their unique dust bathing behavior. It's very important for many species of not only plants but animals and insects and lepidopterans like butterflies. So ecologically, as a keystone species, very critical to be restoring our prairie ecosystem, our high elevation desert steppes like here, the tall grass prairies in the Midwest. By restoring this animal, we are improving the ecological integrity of the landscapes in which they occupy. For Native American people, it's very important for cultural revitalization. When that animal was removed from our diet, it's resulted in high rates of diabetes, heart disease, and other health-related issues. When the animal was removed, we became reliant on the federal government to supply food rations. Oftentimes, that was flour and sugar. If you've ever had fry bread, which is a misnomer of traditional food, it is not. It is survival food. Because when the Native Americans were starving and reliant on the federal government, oftentimes it was rotten meat that was provided, but also flour and sugar. And so the Indians learned how to make bread from those supplies, and that's where we get fry bread. But that is not a traditional food. So as we begin to work on cultural revitalization, it's also about restoring our native food traditions. Buffalo is central to that, but also gathering and ensuring that we have access to our traditional foods that grow in abundance around the landscape, in riparian areas, in the deserts, in the mountains. These were all gathered at certain times of the year historically by our people that we no longer do. And so buffalo is about food sovereignty and security. And so as we restore that animal, it improves not only the landscape, it helps heal that intergenerational trauma and atrocities of the past by being able to reconnect our young people with that animal. But as we begin ingesting it, we're going to get healthier from the inside out because it's higher in protein, lower in cholesterol, and higher in minerals than almost any other meat. And so it's very important as a food source for our native people.
How did the buffalo survive the genocide? I mean, there were tens of millions of them, and the numbers got very small. Tell us that story.
So when Lewis and Clark came west in 1804, they witnessed and described in their journals about 30 to 60 million bison. Within 100 years, by 1902, there were less than 100 left. There was probably 1,000 on the continent, but there was only 23 in Yellowstone. And so Yellowstone grew up around that isolated population of bison. There were people like William Hornaday and Theodore Roosevelt who recognized that the buffalo was going to go extinct, and so they started the American Bison Society. There were some animals that were transferred to the Bronx Zoo, to Wichita National Park, Wichita in Kansas, and some went to Texas. But there were about 5 individuals who took some of those remaining Yellowstone bison and started herds of their own, like the Pablo Allard herd, which is now the herd at the National Bison Range in Montana. But really, they wanted to create a better cow. Cows were weak, were an invasive species, came from Europe. They were susceptible to disease, actually brought disease with them. But cattle couldn't survive the harsh climatic conditions of this region. And so by attempting to make a better cow, they created cattle gene integration in the bison genome. And so today there's about 850,000 or so bison in the United States. 90% of those have cattle gene integration. They're often under commercial meat production, and they're genetically manipulated for things like ease of handling or docility. The focus of my work is with less than 25,000 bison that are genetically pure, have Yellowstone genetics, and also come with certified disease-free classification. And so the Department of Interior manages about 12 conservation populations that meet that criteria, and we're establishing satellite populations that meet that criteria on tribal lands. So the species itself, existing naturally on the landscape, the natural regulating factors considered wildlife, is still an anomaly. Most buffalo and the buffalo that you want to see on the landscape exist in parks and refuges and private ranches. There's very few places on public land that you can go and see buffalo existing as buffalo. And so that really stresses the need for this work to continue to ensure that we are ensuring the bison genome is healthy and moves on, but also meets a population threshold of 1,000 animals to maintain genetic heterogeneity. Of those 12 conservation populations, as well as the ones on the tribal lands, none of them yet meet that threshold. And so we are still working to ensure that Yellowstone genetics and buffalo that carry that integrity are established in new places on large landscapes that we can build to that population threshold to ensure that the genome is healthy and is maintained.
How did it affect the whole genome when so many of them were killed and there were just really a few dozen left? Was that tiny remaining population sufficient to rebuild, or are there problems built in because so much genetic diversity was lost?
Yeah, that genetic bottleneck that occurred with the bison population was drastic. We lost a tremendous amount of variation with the millions of buffalo that were slaughtered. Size, unique characteristics that you see in a large population, those would have been eliminated. So you're very correct. We had to start in the early 1900s with what we had. The technology now that we have today allows us to really dig into the DNA of a buffalo individually to determine how much integration or cattle genetics is within that animal. And so we can accurately determine, what that level of cattle gene integration is so that we know we have genetically reputable buffalo to establish. And so because of technology, we're better able to ensure that the genetic health is there. But you're completely correct in that there was an extreme amount of variability that was lost in the decimation of those large buffalo herds. We have to work with what we have to work with, and technology allows us to improve that. But of those 12 conservation populations, we can pull from surplus animals to supplement existing populations to ensure that new genetics are being introduced, that the heterogeneity of our individual conservation population herd is improving by bringing in new genetics from elsewhere that still meet that criteria. So we're working to ensure that there isn't another bottleneck, and also ensuring that we can be diverse in supplanting our existing populations with genetics from elsewhere, so that there isn't that problem that arises within those individual populations.
You mentioned that 1,000 animals is a good size for a herd to really have the genetic diversity and the longevity that you're looking for. How do you get to that point, and where are you now?
Well, it varies. Certain tribes have been able to hold on to their land base. The General Allotment Act of 1887 that opened up reservations for homesteading was likely one of the most detrimental acts to affect tribes and sovereignty. It was a way to break up Indian landholding. The effects of the General Allotment Act are still prevalent today, actually very prevalent. And so some tribes have very little land to work with. That doesn't diminish the importance of buffalo to their people. Some tribes are working to implement the buffalo back into their diet. And so the priority is providing meat for children's school lunch programs. Other tribes, for instance, at Fort Peck, has a conservation herd of Yellowstone genetics and also a commercial herd that has some level of integration, but they use that as an economic force to create jobs and bring in income for the tribe.
So that one is the commercial herd, is that hybrid of buffalo and cattle?
Not hybrid. They have cattle gene integration. Hybrid implies that you're breeding a cow with a buffalo, and the result is a half and half. Most of the cattle gene integration that you see in buffalo can only be seen genetically. So actually, they've been able to genetically test the commercial herd at Fort Peck, and the percentage is less than 2%. So you can look at that buffalo, and there's no way that you can tell that it has cattle gene integration because the levels are so small. But they're not at the level of a conservation herd, which is 100% pure Yellowstone buffalo.
Okay.
So, for instance, other reservations have a tremendous opportunity to manage buffalo as wildlife. A lot of tribes don't have the large land base needed to dedicate for wildlife restoration because it's really a paradigm that we're stuck in about forgetting what buffalo looks like on the landscape. Because to see one, we have to go to parks and refuges and private ranches. We don't know how to see them as a wildlife species like longhorn antelope or deer or elk. For some reason, we think we need to fence them in, do roundups and ear tag them and vaccinations, but we don't do that with any other wildlife species. And so we have to shift from the paradigm of thinking that buffalo need to be ranched to instead treating them like our other wildlife species. Get them from their habitat and you bring them back to their new habitat. It's a wildlife reintroduction, case closed. You allow them to exist and grow on their own without manipulation by man. So that's a paradigm shift that we are encouraging and educating our people about. We have to allow for them to exist on a large land base on their own accord and let the population grow and exist. And so we have to build an ownership within our communities to see them that way, ensuring that they are close enough to our community that we can see them as wildlife, not as a ranched buffalo that we ear tag and round up and vaccinate and treat like a cow. And so the opportunity exists here at Wind River for that, to manage them as wildlife, to set protections for bison or buffalo in our game code to ensure that they're protected, and then allocate a certain acreage of land for them so that we build and grow that ownership within our communities to see them as wildlife. Our expansion area is roughly 67,000 acres, which today would be the largest chunk of land where buffalo exist on wildlife, but that's nowhere near the amount of habitat that we have on this reservation. We have hundreds of thousands of acres in the Wind River Mountains, hundreds of thousands of acres in the Owl Creek Mountains. But wildlife management is not about managing wildlife, it's about managing people. And so until we can educate and manage our people to see them as wildlife and respect them as such, then we have a long way to go. But steps are being taken to get to that point, and that is the grander vision for what bison restoration could be here at Wind River. That's not the case for a lot of tribes everywhere, but really this can help set precedent for what buffalo can be not only on tribal lands, but let's talk about putting buffalo back on public lands.
Right. Talk about that. I mean, that seems like that would be a big step from where we are now.
Well, the Bureau of Land Management, our public land agency, prioritizes agriculture, grazing, and oil and gas development over what I refer to as the wildlife economy. The monetary value of resources supersedes the importance of our wildlife, and that's unfortunate, and I don't think that that is reflective of what the people really feel. The opportunity to restore buffalo to public lands is an American story. What happened to the buffalo, what happened to Native American people, that isn't taught in the history books. But when we educate and inform people about that history, they have ownership in that. It's not just a Native American story, it's an American story, what happened to that bison. In 2016, it was recognized as our national mammal. But where are they? Again, they're in parks and refuges and private ranches. We have to begin that paradigm shift not only amongst our own reservation residents, but American residents, because the buffalo has a rightful place on the landscape in the West. Just because what happened to it, it was eliminated and made way for these beef operations and sheep operations to exist, that doesn't make that right. It is what happened. But what we do now and into the future, where do we prioritize? Do we prioritize the monetary or the economic benefits of exploitation of our resources? Or do we think instead about prioritizing the wildlife economy, the ecological integrity of the plants and animals on the landscape, the way that they were intended by the one above, not by what man dictates, but what was placed here prior to the arrival of Europeans and settlers, and that economy that the Native American people relied on for millennia.
How did you yourself get involved in the restoration of buffalo, of landscapes, the whole cultural piece? You have your own story that goes a ways back.
Yeah, well, I grew up hunting and fishing and camping and spending a lot of time on horseback with my dad on the reservation as a biologist. He was very knowledgeable about plants and animals and riding horses through various mountain meadows. I remember him very clearly pointing out different plants and their scientific name and their tribal name and their uses and medicinal properties and edibleness and things like that. When he retired, we took a trip to East Africa together and visited the major main national parks, the Serengeti, the Masai Mara, Tarangire, Amboseli. We went to the Ngorongoro crater. One of the most memorable experiences that we had together was witnessing the wildebeest, because we drove for over 100 miles on dirt roads, and as far as you could see in every single direction was wildebeest, and we counted over 30 species in amongst that migration. It was incredible. But what was more unfathomable was that was less than 5% of what the bison was here less than 200 years ago. And so when I returned home, I had a newfound appreciation and respect for myself, my people, where I come from, that buffalo, and the history of what's gone on in this country to lead up to what is now. And unfortunately, that's not a very good story or history to learn about, but it's incredibly important so that we know where we're going. And the atrocities that happened not only to my people, but to that buffalo should have never happened. But nonetheless, we are now in an era of self-determination. We have the sovereignty. We have the ability and the drive to move forward with what is fixing something that was taken from us. And so I knew that I needed to have an education when I returned. I focused my entire academic career on bison restoration. My undergraduate work was to develop a draft management plan for what bison restoration on the reservation could look like. I received an EPA Star Fellowship in graduate school for improving community and ecological health by restoration of bison. And in my final graduate thesis was actually the cultural plant biodiversity in relic wallows and tribal bison policy. And so when I returned home, it was natural for me to collaborate with other like-minded entities, and that was the National Wildlife Federation's Tribal Partnerships Program, where I contracted with to take small steps towards bison restoration here at Wind River on behalf of the Shoshone tribe. We passed resolutions in support of those things. We were able to facilitate agreements with the Department of the Interior on surplus Yellowstone bison. The Shoshone tribe allocated a particular piece of land initially for our bison restoration effort. And so today we work on partnering with the Northern Arapaho tribe. We want to move the two tribal programs together as one under the auspices of our tribal fish and game program or agency that already manages the other wildlife species that we have. And so it's a win-win for the buffalo, but it's also a win-win for the tribes and moving forward in managing them as a wildlife species on this reservation. We're far from where we need to be, but we continue to make small victories towards getting there. And this isn't, a 2 or 3 or 5 year plan. It doesn't matter how long this takes. It has to move forward in this direction the way that our grandmas and grandpas would have wanted us to do that. And that is giving the animal the utmost respect on the landscape, and that is as wildlife. And so we just have to take the steps to get there and take our small victories when we get them and take on the challenges as they arise as well to ensure that we mitigate and ensure that no one's being jeopardized by it, that it's a win-win for everybody, both tribes, cattle people on the reservation, but also the buffalo and the other wildlife species that will benefit from their presence.
You're talking about buffalo as wildlife, which is what they historically were, and there was hunting. How do you see that now on the Shoshone Reservation where you're from? I mean, is eating them becoming part of what you're doing? I know that it was like about 4 years ago that they were restored to the land. Is that right? And have you been eating buffalo from the land since then?
Not so much yet. Earlier this year, when COVID broke out and the grocery stores were limited in food, we did harvest 2 buffalo. We donated one to the Arapaho tribe, and we kept one for ourselves to distribute the meat to first the disabled, then the elderly, and then anyone else who wanted it, belonging to the 2 tribes. So beginning to eat that animal again is critical. We do want to grow our population to a level where it's sustainable, and eventually those animals will be hunted as a means of management. But until we grow our population to the level where we can not harm our genetics or not jeopardize the breeding and the hierarchy that exists amongst the buffalo herd, because they're a matriarchal animal. The herd female is the one that dictates what they do. And so you don't want to mess with that hierarchy. You want them to exist as naturally as possible. But eating them is part of the plan. Of course, there was no wildlife here. Wildlife and wilderness is a bit of a misnomer, because for Native people, they weren't wild. There was no wilderness. So those types of notions were also brought here and are a bit foreign for us, because we utilized and had a relationship with every animal that was here. It wasn't seen as wild. It just was, and it existed. There was no fences. They weren't confined. And so, being able to distinguish between some of these misnomers is also important in understanding the worldview of our people. And oftentimes that's been misaligned with environmental organizations that want to restore buffalo, but they can't understand why you would eat them. And that's a misconception, because we have a relationship with those animals. We utilize them for health and for sustenance. But there is a deeply profound respect for those animals. So we have to be able to navigate those ways of looking about how we utilize those animals.
So you're talking about restoration of the buffalo in terms of, I mean, I totally get what you're saying about, the idea of wildlife being a Western idea, but nevertheless, when you're talking about keystone species and wildlife and landscapes, and you're talking about food sovereignty, and you're talking about relearning some of the cultural practices that went along with using the whole animal, I was wondering if there was also a trauma healing piece of this, in the sense that when a genocide has been perpetrated fairly recently on a group of people, that part of a healing process for people who were traditionally called buffalo eaters?
Well, certainly. We weren't legally able to practice ceremonial ways until 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And so the ceremonies that we had to keep secret and away from people so that they could be maintained. Now that we're in an era, again, of self-determination, but also cultural revitalization, a lot of this is exposing our young people back to our ceremonial customs and ways. That's where the healing really happens, is through prayer and spirituality, which has been missing for some time. The buffalo is central to those ceremonies. Oftentimes, a buffalo heart is needed to begin one of those ceremonies. Another ceremony is representative of the buffalo rib cage. The sweat or the purification ceremony or lodge is representing that animal, and there's everything in the universe is represented in those ceremonies, and you can't have them without that buffalo. And so, the people who believe and participate in those ceremonies, they can be, I don't know about, not ramped up, but the buffalo can be included finally in there, which hasn't happened for 100 years. And so the majority of our population is under the age of 30. With the deaths of our elders, so goes our language and worldview and morals and values that were common amongst our old people. We have a tremendous challenge ahead of us in ensuring that our young people are educated and knowledgeable about federal Indian law, the history of our own reservations, what tribal leadership and sovereignty means and how you exercise that. If we're not creating leadership amongst our young people, then what does our future really hold for us if we no longer have our language or if our ceremonial customs, ways, and beliefs go away? We're no longer Shoshone then. We are assimilated, colonized people that are lost. And so that healing of that buffalo and bringing it back has a lot of ramifications, some that we don't even know about. We don't know how that buffalo is going to help some people heal, but just having them here does. When students go out there and they can take a piece of buffalo hair, that does. When we provide buffalo meat to the community members, that's healing by being able to eat it. When we develop our educational curriculum around buffalo to teach our people again about how you say a part of that buffalo in our languages, how you process that to use it, all of those things are elements of healing. And so just having the buffalo here available for that, we could have never imagined 5 years ago that we would be where we are now. I hope that it's the same in the next 5 years, where we can recognize these animals as wildlife or animals that belong on the landscape under wildlife status, and we can begin to utilize that animal again for what it has to offer. And that is healing.
There was this amazing moment where you were on the reservation and there were 5 buffalo that were supposed to have been transported for a reintroduction and a ceremony, but they got stuck because of the weather. But then something very interesting happened. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so, our initial 10 buffalo in 2016 came from the Neil Smith Wildlife Refuge in Iowa. In 2017, our second batch came from the National Bison Range in Montana, again, at 2 conservation populations. In last year, we developed an agreement with the Fort Peck tribes to have a sovereign-to-sovereign, government-to-government agreement to share in the offspring of Yellowstone buffalo. And so planning for those 5 bulls from Fort Peck to arrive created a few challenges for us. In that we had planned on 3 occasions to have these buffalo brought down, but at Fort Peck, first it was snow, and then rain, and then mud, so the truck couldn't get there to pick the buffalo up and bring them down. And, in order to plan for an event like that, you let people know that that buffalo are on their way. And we did that 3 times. And again, on the 3rd time, the buffalo were held up. There was too much mud. The truck couldn't get in there. But we had anticipated that it was going to work that time. And so we made arrangements for community members and leadership to be present. And even though we knew the buffalo weren't going to arrive, the 5 bulls, we knew they weren't going to arrive, we went ahead with a small ceremony for the people that were present. And so we had a drum group. The drum and our songs are like the heartbeat of our people. They're very important to us. Many of our songs are thousands of years old. And so then using that ceremony to honor those buffalo was what was done. We used our ceremonial sage or sweetgrass to purify and bless the area and to sing songs. And so the drum group began singing songs to honor the buffalo, and the area where we were was overlooking where the buffalo herd was. There were 30 individual buffalo that were down off of the bluff, and people were looking at them. And so while the singers continued with their drum song, there were 5 bulls that came up the hill from that population, almost in metaphor for the absence of the 5 that were to be brought. And during that drum song, the buffalo, those 5 bulls came towards the drum and the singers. It was as though they were dancing. And they made a couple circles and were stomping their feet. And it was a very sublime moment for the people that were there. It was as though these buffalo were standing in the place of the 5 that were to be brought and celebrated alongside us the importance of that, the buffalo being there and the buffalo to our people. It was really incredible. It was very hard to describe because to witness something like that, you almost have to be present for it. But the buffalo, they came and they greeted the drum and they did their song, they did their dance, and then they moved on. And everybody that was there felt that incredible power, that moment of appreciation for what was happening. And it was a very spiritual experience and moment, and very hard to describe, but very special nonetheless.
It really is an amazing story because it just seems like such a good omen for not only buffalo restoration, but for that mutual and reciprocal understanding between these animals and the people.
You know, today we try to demystify everything around us. We want to try to explain how everything happens and how things work. And for Native people, we have a belief in the great mystery, that there's a lot of knowledge in not knowing everything and not being able to explain everything. And that was an example of that. The connection that we have to the unknown, the spirit world, the metaphysical around us, the connection of our ceremonies to our ancestors. You know, you can't explain that type of stuff with science. You just have to accept that it's the great mystery. And that's an example of that the Native people, we don't have to explain what happened that day, but we know that it was extremely magical.
Jason Valdez is Tribal Buffalo Coordinator for the National Wildlife Federation. Anything else you want to let people know about or talk about before we go?
No, I just really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and everybody. I think that, buffalo, again, is not only important to Native Americans, but it's important to all Americans. That story needs to be shared and told, and we have to begin fixing some of the wrongs that have happened to this land, to the people, and ensure that future generations don't go through anything similar. And so buffalo is life's commissary. We always say, it doesn't matter the challenge or the storm, that buffalo will always face into the storm and take on whatever is coming and get through it. And I think that is a metaphor for life for all of us. Take on that storm, take on that challenge, and try to do what you can to make things right. And that buffalo will give you the strength to do it.
Jason, thank you so much for being with us on Down to Earth.
Thank you very much.
This program is produced in collaboration with the Quivira Coalition, a non-for-profit educational organization and community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to the resilience of arid working lands. Their work aims to shift current practices of agriculture and land stewardship to those that produce good food, support meaningful livelihoods in rural places, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira, coalition.org. You've been listening to Down to Earth, a production of the Quivira Coalition and the Radio Cafe. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. If you like this program, please share it with your network. And we'd love your feedback. Go to downtoearth.media, where you can contact us and you can sign up for the mailing list. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. We're producing this show bi-weekly and would love your comments and ideas, so once again, downtoearth.media, and check out the Quivira Coalition, quiviracoalition.org, that's Quivira. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.